Margaret Sullivan pressed her trembling fingers against the cracked mirror in the tiny boarding house room. The bruise blooming purple across her left cheekbone told the same story as the dozen before it. 3 years of marriage to Edmund Pierce had transformed her from a hopeful young woman into a ghost who flinched at shadows. The gas lamps flickered in the Philadelphia street below, casting dancing shadows across walls that had witnessed too many of her tears. Edmund would return from the tavern soon, and she knew what that meant. His heavy boots on the stairs, the smell of whiskey preceding him like a warning, the inevitable rage that followed. Tonight had been worse than usual. He'd thrown her mother's teacup, the only possession she had left from her childhood, and it shattered against the wall near her head. Margaret was 24 years old, and she felt ancient. The year was 1876, and women like her had precious few options. Divorce was scandalous, nearly impossible to obtain, and would leave her destitute. Returning to her family wasn't possible because her parents had died during the cholera outbreak 2 years prior, their modest savings consumed by medical bills before the end. She had no siblings, no cousins who could take her in, no trust fund to fall back on. She was trapped in a nightmare with no visible exit. The advertisement caught her eye 3 days later while she was pretending to shop at the general store, actually hiding from Edmund's temper. It was pinned to the community board among notices for farm equipment and livestock sales. The paper was cream-colored, the handwriting careful and measured. It read simply, "Respectable gentleman seeking correspondence with woman of good character. Possibility of marriage for suitable match. Write to Thomas McCarthy, Deadwood, Dakota Territory." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she copied the address onto a scrap of paper with shaking hands. Dakota Territory was as far from Philadelphia as the moon. It represented freedom, escape, a chance to breathe air that didn't taste of fear. That night, while Edmund snored off his drunken stupor, she composed her letter by candlelight, her words careful and honest. She described herself truthfully: brown hair, green eyes, capable with household duties, educated enough to read and write well. She didn't mention Edmund. She didn't mention the bruises. She only wrote about her hope for a fresh start. The reply came 6 weeks later, forwarded through a friend's address so Edmund wouldn't intercept it. Thomas McCarthy's letter was kind, straightforward, and surprisingly gentle. He was a merchant in Deadwood, he wrote, a widower of 42 who missed having a partner to share life's burdens and joys. He promised respect, a comfortable home, and safety. That last word made Margaret's eyes sting with tears. Safety. Such a simple thing, yet so impossibly out of reach. They exchanged 3 more letters over the following months. Margaret hid each one inside the lining of her winter coat, terrified Edmund would discover her secret. Thomas seemed genuine, describing his daily life with endearing detail. He wrote about the wild beauty of the Black Hills, the challenges of frontier commerce, his hope that she might find happiness in the West. He sent money for her train passage in his 4th letter, more money than Margaret had seen in years. The decision crystallized one freezing November night when Edmund came home in a rage over a card game gone wrong. He grabbed her by the throat, lifting her off her feet, his bloodshot eyes empty of humanity. Something inside Margaret simply broke. Not her spirit, but her fear. When he finally released her and stumbled to bed, she didn't cry. She packed a single carpet bag with her few possessions, took the money Thomas had sent, and walked out into the snow-dusted Philadelphia streets. She never looked back at the boarding house. She walked through the darkness until she reached the train station, where she bought a ticket west with money that represented not just passage, but salvation. As the locomotive pulled away from Philadelphia 12 hours later, Margaret watched her old life disappear into the distance and allowed herself something she hadn't felt in 3 years: hope. The train rattled westward through landscapes that grew progressively wilder and more beautiful. Margaret sat pressed against the window of the third-class car, watching forests give way to plains, cities shrink into towns, civilization gradually dissolve into raw frontier. Each mile between herself and Edmund felt like a weight lifting from her chest. She could breathe deeper. She could sleep without nightmares of fists and fury. The other passengers were a mixture of prospectors seeking gold, families chasing cheap land, and women like herself, though none admitted it openly. Mail-order brides carried their own shame, their own desperate circumstances. Margaret befriended a young woman named Sarah who was traveling to meet a rancher in Wyoming. They shared bread and stories, careful to keep their voices low in the crowded car. The journey took 8 days. 8 days of uncomfortable wooden benches, stale food purchased at station stops, and increasing anxiety about what awaited her. Margaret reread Thomas's letters until she had them memorized. He seemed kind, but Edmund had seemed charming once too. What if she was trading one prison for another? What if Thomas was cruel? What if Deadwood was worse than Philadelphia? The questions circled her mind like vultures. The Black Hills emerged on the horizon like a dark promise. Mountains rose against the sky, covered in pine forests so dense they looked black from a distance. The air through the train windows smelled different here, clean and sharp with a hint of wood smoke and possibility. Margaret's stomach twisted with nervous anticipation as the train pulled into Deadwood Station on a crisp December afternoon. The town was nothing like Philadelphia. Muddy streets churned by wagon wheels and foot traffic wound between hastily constructed buildings. Men far outnumbered women, and most carried firearms openly. The air rang with hammers, shouts, the occasional gunshot that made Margaret jump. This was the Wild West she'd read about in dime novels, raw and dangerous and completely foreign to everything she knew. She stepped onto the platform clutching her carpetbag, searching the crowd for Thomas McCarthy. Her instructions were to meet him at the station at 2 o'clock. A man approached, removing his hat politely. He was tall and thin with graying hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. "Miss Sullivan?" he asked hopefully. But before Margaret could respond, chaos erupted. A gunfight broke out in the street between two miners arguing over a claim. Bullets whined through the air. People screamed and scattered. Thomas grabbed Margaret's arm, pulling her toward a nearby building for shelter. They pressed against the wall as shots echoed off the surrounding structures. Margaret's heart pounded wildly. This was madness. She'd escaped one danger only to land in another. The shooting stopped as suddenly as it started. One miner lay dead in the mud, and the other was dragged away by the sheriff. Thomas's face was pale but composed. "I'm terribly sorry," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Deadwood can be rough, but I promise my home is safe and quiet." They walked through the muddy streets toward the edge of town where Thomas's house stood, a modest but well-maintained structure with glass windows and a stone chimney. Margaret tried to calm her racing heart. Inside, the home was clean and orderly, furnished simply but comfortably. Thomas showed her to a small bedroom. "This is yours," he said firmly. "I expect nothing until we're properly married, and only then if you're willing. I'm a patient man, Miss Sullivan. I understand you've traveled far and need time to adjust." His kindness made Margaret's eyes burn with unexpected tears. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. That night, she lay in a real bed with clean sheets, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of Deadwood settling into darkness. For the first time in years, she felt safe enough to sleep deeply. The next morning brought more surprises. Thomas prepared breakfast, insisting she rest after her long journey. They talked carefully, testing the waters of their arrangement. He was indeed kind, a bit awkward perhaps, but genuine in his desire for companionship. Margaret began to think she might actually survive this gamble. But Deadwood had other plans. 3 days before their planned wedding, Thomas collapsed while carrying supplies into his store. The doctor was blunt: heart failure, probably fatal within hours. Margaret sat beside his bed as he struggled for breath, this stranger who had offered her salvation. "I'm sorry," Thomas whispered, his hand cold in hers. "I hope to give you a good life." He died that evening. Margaret stood in his house, now truly alone in a lawless town where she knew no one, with almost no money and winter closing in. Thomas's few relatives would claim his property. She had nowhere to go, no way back to Philadelphia even if she wanted to return. The trap had simply changed shape. Thomas McCarthy's funeral was sparsely attended. A few fellow merchants, the preacher, and Margaret standing beside a grave dug into frozen ground. The wind cut through her thin coat as they lowered the simple coffin into the earth. She hadn't known him long enough to grieve deeply, but she mourned the future he'd represented, the security that had died with him. Thomas's cousin arrived from Denver within a week, a pinch-faced man named Herbert who made it clear Margaret had no claim to anything. The house, the store, the modest savings all belonged to the family. He gave her 3 days to vacate the premises. Margaret stood in the street with her carpetbag once again, watching her brief hope of stability dissolve like morning frost. Deadwood offered few options for respectable women. The saloons always needed girls, but Margaret knew what that meant and the thought made her stomach turn. Some families needed housekeepers, but those positions were rare and already filled. The boarding houses were expensive, and her money would last perhaps 2 weeks. After that, she'd face choices that terrified her more than Edmund's fists ever had. She found work washing laundry for a Chinese family who ran a service for the miners. The labor was brutal, her hands raw and bleeding from lye soap and scalding water. She earned barely enough for a bed in a cramped room shared with 3 other women. The winter cold seeped through the thin walls. At night, she lay awake wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake leaving Philadelphia. At least with Edmund, she'd had a roof and regular meals. The Lakota had been coming to Deadwood despite the tensions. The Black Hills were sacred to them, stolen by gold-hungry whites who ignored treaties and promises. Most townspeople treated the native visitors with suspicion or outright hostility. Margaret noticed them at the trading posts, dignified and watchful, their presence a reminder that this land had belonged to others first. One frozen January morning, Margaret was walking back from the pump with heavy water buckets when she slipped on ice. She fell hard, buckets clattering, water soaking through her already threadbare dress. The cold was instant and shocking. She struggled to rise, but her ankle had twisted painfully. Panic set in as she realized she couldn't stand, and the temperature was well below freezing. Her wet clothes would kill her if she didn't find shelter soon. A shadow fell across her. Margaret looked up, expecting a miner or shopkeeper. Instead, she saw a Lakota man, tall and imposing in buckskin and furs. His face was weathered and strong, his dark eyes assessing her situation with quick intelligence. He spoke in his own language, words she couldn't understand, but the tone was questioning, concerned. Margaret tried to stand again and gasped as pain shot through her ankle. The man made a decision. Before she could protest, he bent and lifted her easily, cradling her against his chest as if she weighed nothing. Margaret's first instinct was fear, all the stories she'd heard about savage Indians flooding her mind. But his hold was careful, almost gentle, and he was carrying her toward the trading post, not away from town. Inside, he set her down near the stove and spoke rapidly to the trader in a mixture of Lakota and broken English. The trader, a grizzled man named Foster, looked surprised but fetched blankets. "Grey Hawk says you need warming," Foster translated roughly. "Says you would have frozen." Margaret stared at her rescuer, this man called Grey Hawk. He was perhaps 40, with silver threading through his long black hair. His face was angular and proud, marked by old scars that spoke of a hard life. He watched her with an intensity that should have been frightening but somehow wasn't. When their eyes met, she saw not the savage of frontier stories but a person, complex and intelligent. Foster brought coffee, and Grey Hawk pressed the warm cup into her shaking hands. He spoke again, and Foster translated haltingly. "He asks where your man is, why you're alone in such cold." "I have no man," Margaret said quietly. "I'm alone." The translation made Grey Hawk's expression shift to something that might have been understanding or pity. He spoke at length, his deep voice rhythmic and compelling even though she couldn't understand the words. Foster's translation was rough. "He says alone is dangerous for a woman here. He asks if you have food, shelter." Margaret's pride warred with desperation. She shook her head slowly. Grey Hawk and Foster exchanged a long conversation. Finally, Foster turned to her, his expression skeptical. "Grey Hawk's offering something unusual. His wife died 2 winters past. He needs someone to manage his household, prepare food, work hides. He'll provide shelter, food, protection. It ain't a white arrangement, understand. You'd be living in a Lakota camp." Margaret's first response was instinctive refusal. Live among the Lakota? Leave civilization entirely? The idea was absurd, dangerous, impossible. Every story she'd ever heard painted Indians as violent savages who scalped settlers and burned wagons. Yet Grey Hawk sat across from her in the trading post, watching her with patient eyes that held none of the cruelty she'd known in Edmund's gaze. He'd saved her from freezing. He was offering survival when she had no other options. Foster lit his pipe and studied her carefully. "I've known Grey Hawk for 5 years, he said quietly. "He's a chief's son, respected among his people. He's offering honest work, not what you're thinking. The Lakota treat their women better than most white men, if you want the truth of it. But it'll be hard, and you'll be an outsider. You'll have to decide what you fear more, starvation in Deadwood or a different life in the hills." Margaret looked at her raw, bleeding hands, felt the cold seeping through her wet clothes despite the stove's warmth. She thought about Edmund's fists, Thomas's broken promises of safety, the desperate future waiting for her in Deadwood's cruel streets. What did she really have to lose? Her reputation was already ruined. Her chances in white society were non-existent. At least Grey Hawk was offering her a choice, which was more than most men had done. "I'll go," she whispered. The words felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. Grey Hawk nodded once, his expression unchanged, as if he'd expected this answer. He spoke to Foster, who provided Margaret with dry clothes and basic supplies. Within an hour, she was mounted on a sturdy pony behind Grey Hawk, leaving Deadwood behind. The winter landscape stretched endlessly white and pristine. The Black Hills rose around them like protective walls, the pine forests dense and mysterious. They rode for hours in silence. Margaret clung to Grey Hawk's back, terrified of falling, overwhelmed by what she'd agreed to. The cold bit through her borrowed furs, but Grey Hawk seemed immune to it, guiding the horse with easy confidence through terrain that looked identical in every direction. How did he know where he was going? What was she doing? The Lakota camp appeared in a valley protected by hills, a collection of teepees arranged in a careful circle near a half-frozen stream. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Dogs barked at their approach. People emerged from the dwellings, their faces curious and wary as they saw the white woman. Margaret's courage nearly failed. She didn't belong here. This was madness. Grey Hawk dismounted and helped her down with unexpected gentleness. He spoke to the gathering crowd in Lakota, his voice carrying authority. An elderly woman approached, her face deeply lined, her eyes sharp and assessing. She circled Margaret slowly, then said something that made several people laugh. Grey Hawk responded firmly, and the laughter stopped. The elderly woman, whose name Margaret later learned was Winona, took her to a teepee larger than the others. Inside, it was surprisingly warm, a fire burning in the center, the floor covered with furs and woven mats. The space was organized and clean, decorated with painted designs and stored supplies. This was Grey Hawk's home, and now, somehow, hers. The first weeks were brutal. The language barrier made everything difficult. Margaret couldn't understand instructions, couldn't ask questions, couldn't explain her needs. The work was constant and exhausting, processing animal hides, preparing food over open fires, hauling water in freezing temperatures, learning to work with materials and tools completely foreign to her. Her hands, already damaged from laundry work, cracked and bled. Her back ached constantly. She fell into her sleeping furs each night too exhausted for tears. But slowly, patterns emerged. Winona, despite her sharp tongue, was patient in teaching. She showed Margaret how to scrape hides properly, how to prepare pemmican, how to keep the fire going efficiently. A young woman named Marka became something like a friend, using gestures and simple words to communicate, laughing kindly when Margaret made mistakes. The children were curious about her, touching her brown hair and pale skin with wonder, calling her Hinskawin, which she learned meant tall woman. Grey Hawk maintained a respectful distance. He provided for her, ensured she had warm furs and adequate food, but made no demands. He slept on the opposite side of the teepee, a careful space between them. Sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't read. He began teaching her Lakota words in the evenings, pointing to objects and speaking slowly. Minnie, he'd say, holding water. Peter, touching the fire. Margaret repeated the words, stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds, but gradually building a basic vocabulary. Winter deepened, and the camp settled into survival mode. Margaret learned that the Lakota were here illegally in White Eyes, that the Black Hills had been promised to them by treaty then stolen when gold was discovered. She learned about the battles fought, the loved ones lost, the constant pressure from settlers and soldiers. These weren't the savages of frontier stories. They were people fighting to maintain their way of life against overwhelming forces. One night, a terrible storm struck the camp. Wind howled like living things, ripping at the teepees, driving snow through every gap. Margaret huddled by the fire, terrified the shelter would collapse. Grey Hawk worked calmly, reinforcing stakes, adjusting the smoke flaps, his movements practiced and sure. When she shivered violently, he moved closer, wrapping a buffalo robe around both of them, sharing warmth without presumption. In that moment, pressed against him for survival, Margaret felt something shift inside her. This man had saved her twice now. He'd offered her shelter when she had nothing, asked for only honest work in return, and treated her with more respect than Edmund had managed in 3 years of marriage. Spring transformed the Black Hills into a revelation of life. Wildflowers exploded across meadows in waves of purple and yellow. The stream near camp ran full and clear with snowmelt. The Lakota people seemed to expand with the season, their movements less constrained, their voices carrying laughter and song. Margaret had survived the winter, and in surviving, she'd become something different. Her hands had toughened into capable tools. She could scrape a hide properly now, prepare a dozen different meals from bison and wild plants, set up a teepee in the driving rain. She spoke halting but functional Lakota, enough to trade jokes with Winona and tell stories to the children. The women of the camp had stopped viewing her with suspicion and started including her in their daily rhythms. She was still an outsider, but an accepted one. Grey Hawk had become her constant companion in ways that surprised her. They worked together preparing for the summer hunt, and in those long hours, conversation flowed more easily. He told her about his wife, killed in a cavalry raid on their winter camp 3 years prior. The grief in his voice was raw and honest. He spoke about his children, grown now with families of their own, scattered among different bands. He described his youth, learning to hunt and fight, earning his place as a warrior and leader. Margaret found herself sharing stories she'd never told anyone. About her parents' death, about Edmund's cruelty, about the desperate loneliness of her Philadelphia existence. Greyhawk listened without judgment, his dark eyes reflecting understanding that transcended language barriers. When she cried, he didn't offer empty comfort but simply sat with her pain, acknowledging it as real and worthy. Something was growing between them, delicate and unexpected. Margaret noticed the way her heart lifted when Greyhawk returned from hunting. She caught herself watching him work, admiring the competence in his movements, the quiet strength in his presence. When their hands brushed accidentally while working, she felt electricity race up her arm. This was nothing like her feelings for Edmund, which had been based on youthful naivety and social pressure. This was deeper, built on respect and shared survival. One evening in late May, Greyhawk asked her to walk with him. They climbed to a ridge overlooking the valley where camp spread below them like a living tapestry. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. Greyhawk spoke carefully in Lakota, and Margaret understood enough to grasp his meaning. He was asking if she was content, if she planned to stay or return to the white world. Margaret looked at the camp, at the life she'd built here. She thought about Deadwood with its violence and desperation, about Philadelphia and Edmund's fists. She thought about the women who'd taught her, the children who called her aunt, the strange peace she'd found working beside people who valued contribution over appearance, competence over compliance. "I want to stay," she said in careful Lakota. "This is home now." Greyhawk's face softened into something that might have been relief or joy. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. His palm was calloused and warm against hers. "You are brave," he said in English, one of the few phrases he'd learned. "You are strong. You belong here." The courtship that followed was nothing like Margaret's first marriage. There was no rush, no social pressure, no economic desperation. Greyhawk brought her gifts, a knife with a beautiful beaded sheath that Winona had helped him make, a necklace of elk teeth that represented successful hunts, wild roses picked from the high meadows. They spent evenings talking, sharing dreams and fears, learning to navigate the space between their different worlds. When Greyhawk formally asked her to become his wife in the Lakota way, Margaret said yes without hesitation. The ceremony was simple but profound, conducted by the camp's spiritual leader with the whole community witnessing. Margaret wore a dress of soft buckskin decorated with quill work, made for her by the camp women. Greyhawk stood beside her in his finest clothes, his face serious but his eyes warm. They spoke vows of partnership, not ownership. The Lakota way emphasized mutual respect between husband and wife, shared decision-making, and individual autonomy within the marriage bond. Margaret would keep her own property, her own voice, her own power. It was nothing like the legal death she'd experienced in white marriage where women became their husbands' possessions. That night, in their teepee with the fire burning low, Greyhawk held her gently and asked permission for every touch. The intimacy between them was tender and careful, built on trust rather than expectation. Margaret discovered what it meant to be with a man who valued her pleasure and comfort as much as his own. She fell asleep in his arms feeling safe, truly safe, for the first time in years. The following summer brought challenges. Word reached the camp that the army was forcing Lakota bands onto reservations, that the Black Hills were being overrun by miners and settlers. Greyhawk and the other leaders debated their options: fight, flee, or surrender. Margaret watched her husband struggle with impossible choices, wishing she could shield him from the pain of watching his world shrink. In council meetings, Margaret's voice was heard alongside the men's, a shocking equality she'd never experienced in white society. She offered insights about settler thinking, about supply lines and military movements, information that proved valuable. The Lakota people had accepted her fully, her white skin no longer a barrier but simply another characteristic like height or eye color. When soldiers finally came to force the band onto a reservation, Margaret and Greyhawk made a choice together. They would go, but they would maintain their identity, their language, their customs. They would survive this too, as they'd survived winter and loss and every other hardship. Years later, Margaret would sit with her grandchildren in a small house on the reservation, telling them stories about Philadelphia, about Deadwood, about the journey that brought her to their grandfather. She would describe escaping death and finding life, about learning that home wasn't a place but the people who saw you truly and loved you anyway. Her hands, weathered by decades of hard work, would gesture as she spoke, and her eyes would shine with memories of the man who'd saved her twice, once from freezing, and once from the slow death of living without purpose or love. She'd escaped Edmund's fists and found Greyhawk's embrace. She'd fled civilization and discovered humanity. She'd lost everything and gained a life worth living. The mail-order bride who'd stepped off that train in Deadwood had died, and in her place rose a woman who belonged to herself, to her chosen people, and to the man who'd shown her that strength could be gentle and love could set you free.